When I built the different components of my automated agency, I always imagined them as separate systems. Acquisition was one system, delivery was another, communication a third, and each one of them worked well enough on its own. But the real breakthrough happened when I realized that the systems weren't the important part. The architecture was, the way they connected, the way information flowed, the decisions they made automatically, the logic that allowed the entire agency to operate without me having to manage it day after day. And once I understood this, everything shifted. I stopped thinking in tasks. I stopped thinking in workflows. I began thinking in structures, foundations, layers, relationships. This is the architecture behind the automated agency, the part nobody sees, but the part that makes everything possible. The first thing I learned is that architecture begins with separation. Most people try to automate everything at once. They create a giant, tangled system with hundreds of dependencies. And because everything depends on everything else, one small change breaks the entire structure. The automated agency doesn't work like that. It is built on the idea that each system should be independent enough to run alone, but connected enough to share information. This balance is the foundation. Independence creates stability. Connection creates intelligence. And the architecture sits in the middle, coordinating everything without becoming a bottleneck. At the top of the architecture is the control layer. Not a tool, not a dashboard, a layer. A layer that receives signals from every other system. Signals from acquisition, signals from delivery, signals from communication, signals from retention. The control layer doesn't produce work, it makes decisions. If acquisition detects a qualified prospect, the control layer authorizes the next steps. If delivery completes an iteration, the control layer triggers refinement. If a client message requires a response, the control layer dispatches the communication system. It is not a workflow. It is a decision engine. And this is what allows the agency to feel coordinated, not chaotic. Below the control layer are the operational systems: acquisition, delivery, communication, retention, and learning. Each system has its own rules, its own inputs, its own outputs. Each one is built to solve a specific part of the agency, and none of them waits for human input. This was the hardest shift to make. Instead of thinking about what I needed to do, I built systems that anticipated what needed to happen. In a traditional agency, you act when something requires attention. In an automated agency, the systems act before attention is required. They predict, they prepare, they initialize. And the architecture connects these predictions so the next step begins automatically. Acquisition is the first system in the chain, but in the architecture, acquisition isn't just about finding leads. It's about generating signals. Signals about intent, behavior, timing, fit, and potential. These signals go directly to the control layer. The architecture doesn't treat prospects as people to message. It treats them as data. Patterns, scores, indicators. And when the indicators cross a threshold, the architecture begins the activation sequence. This is where the next system wakes up. Delivery is the second major system. But most people misunderstand delivery. They think it starts after someone pays. In the automated agency, delivery starts before. The moment acquisition signals that a person is likely to convert, the architecture prepares the delivery engine. It analyzes the person's profile. It gathers context. It initializes templates. It begins structuring the first version of the output. So when the client officially enters, the system is already in motion. This removes the lag time that kills momentum in traditional agencies. The architecture compresses the timeline. And by compressing the timeline, it increases perceived quality. Communication is the third system in the architecture. But communication is not just messages. It is alignment. It is expectation. It is clarity. In a manual agency, communication is reactive. You wait for the client to ask something, then you answer. You wait for a problem, then you solve it. The automated agency inverts that dynamic. The architecture sends communication signals based on events, not emotions. When delivery begins an iteration, the communication system sends an update. When something needs clarification, the communication system asks the client. When the draft is ready, the communication system notifies immediately. Everything happens at the exact right moment because the architecture knows when each moment occurs. Retention is the fourth system, and retention is the hidden multiplier. Retention is what makes an agency stable. When clients stay, acquisition becomes leverage instead of pressure. In the automated agency, retention is built into the architecture itself. The system monitors client results. It detects when performance increases or drops. It recommends new actions. It suggests deliverables. It identifies when the client might need help. It initiates check-ins. Retention happens not because you remember, but because the architecture does. The final system in the operational layer is the learning system. This is what makes the automated agency get better over time. Every output is analyzed. Every piece of communication is evaluated. Every delivery is compared to the ideal standard. Every client behavior is tracked. The architecture doesn't rely on static instructions. It adapts, it evolves, it improves, and over time, the systems become more accurate, more aligned, and more efficient. Learning turns the agency from a fixed structure into a fluid one, a system that grows with the work it produces. Beneath the operational layer is the infrastructure layer. This is where storage happens, where templates live, where data rests, where rules exist. The infrastructure layer is the memory of the agency. And without memory, no system can become intelligent. Infrastructure holds the knowledge the systems use. It holds the examples, the iterations, the improvements, the decisions. When a system generates something, the infrastructure stores it. When a system refines something, the infrastructure updates it. When a system identifies a better pattern, the infrastructure integrates it. This is how the agency becomes stronger with each project. At the bottom of the architecture is the execution layer. This is where tasks are performed, where drafts are generated, where outputs are formatted, where messages are written. The execution layer is not the brain, it is the hands. It does what the control layer decides, using what the infrastructure layer stores. And because the execution layer is simple, the entire architecture becomes stable. If something breaks, it breaks at the bottom, not at the top. What makes this architecture powerful is the flow between layers. Signals go up, decisions come down, information circulates, work moves horizontally, and the architecture remains balanced. No single part carries the weight. No single part becomes a bottleneck. No single part depends on human effort to survive. The moment I saw the agency as an architecture instead of a system, everything clicked. I realized that a system is something you operate. An architecture is something you design. A system requires activity. An architecture requires structure. And when the structure is right, the activity becomes automatic. The systems work together without you forcing them to. The automated agency works because the architecture is invisible. The client doesn't see it. The output doesn't reveal it. But everything they experience is shaped by it. The speed, the clarity, the consistency, the quality. These aren't accidents. They are consequences of a structure designed to remove friction at every layer. What surprised me most is how the architecture changed the way I think about work. I stopped looking for tools. I started looking for functions. I stopped thinking about tasks. I started thinking about transitions. I stopped focusing on actions. I started focusing on flow. The architecture changed my perspective from doing the work to designing the work. In the next video, I'll break down the actual flow inside the architecture. Not the systems, not the layers, but the transitions. how acquisition hands off to delivery, how delivery hands off to communication, how communication triggers retention, how learning updates the entire structure, because the flow is where the agency becomes alive. And once you see how the flow works, you'll understand how an automated agency operates without ever stopping.